Thank you, Austin. And of course, 1 minute ago, my internet just went out. So for now, you have only my voice and not my face. But know that I am smiling at all of you and welcoming you to this really special event. I think that if there is a silver lining to our pandemic state, it is that this meeting can reach so many more people than only those who would be able to show up in DC in person. And I even saw on the invitation list someone from A New Leaf, which is a local nonprofit where I live in Phoenix, Arizona, that I volunteer for. So welcome to them and welcome to all of you in all corners of the country. This first panel has 2 presentations, each with a discussant. And the first session is on the design of the evaluations that are part of SSA's demonstrations. Bert Barnow and David Greenberg crafted an insightful paper on these design issues, and they will present their key findings over the next 15 minutes, followed by discussion from Jesse Rothstein and Jack Smulligan. And as Austin explained, after the discussants, we'll have a brief break and then hear a second presentation with discussants, after which we'll get to those questions that you can drop into the Q&A box on WebEx. So now I will turn it over to Bert Barnow. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Bert Barnow from George Washington University, and I'm going to do the presentation of the design of Social Security Administration demonstration evaluations. I'd like to start by thanking Social Security Administration and APT Associates for inviting us to this most important and interesting conference. This paper is co-authored with David Greenberg, and it's about how the demonstration evaluations were designed. At the highest level, what we aim to do is consider how best to evaluate interventions and to develop changes to policy and programs so that we know what their impacts are and whether they should be rolled out at the national level. We reviewed 16 evaluations, which is what this presentation is based on. Next slide, please. This slide shows the types of evaluations that we have. You can see that we have non-experimental and experimental evaluations. I'll get into that in a second. And on the right side of the slide, we have examples, which I won't be going through for time purposes. The SSA evaluations involve these design types, and the 2 non-experimental types are called proof of concept studies and non-experimental impact evaluation. A proof of concept study simply assesses if an intervention can be successfully implemented, with little emphasis on estimating its impact. Non-experimental impact evaluations assess the impacts of the program, and they have to rely on assumptions to control for differences between the treatment group and what are called comparison groups that do not get the treatment. We encourage the Social Security Administration to continue conducting proof of concept studies. They should be clearly labeled as such so that people aren't looking for impacts when they look at them. And if successful, of course, more rigorous evaluations can be conducted. We believe that the non-experimental impact evaluations that were implemented among the 16 had some limitations, probably because the decision to conduct the evaluations was not made until after the programs were implemented. Most of the designs were experimental in nature, where assignment to the treatment or control group was done with random assignment. And when that's done, the impact of the program can be assessed simply as the difference in the outcomes between the 2 groups. There was also one, what's called a natural experiment, where although assignment wasn't random, it was close to it because it was based on the last digit of people's Social Security numbers, which is close to being random. Next slide, please. Population representativeness. Among major national evaluations, SSA's demonstrations are strong in their efforts to ensure population representativeness. This is important for the results of the evaluations to apply to the overall population of interest, and that's referred to as external validity. Some ways that a given evaluation or a given demonstration may not have external validity is that the experiment or the demonstration may be carried out in limited sites, and they may not be representative of the entire nation because of the characteristics of the recipients or economic conditions may not be representative. Another problem is that demonstrations using volunteers may not be representative of what would happen if the program became mandatory. And as we heard in Jeffrey's introduction, SSA has limitations on doing things that are mandatory. Finally, demonstrations that focus on specific medical conditions like diabetes or mental health problems may not generalize to findings for other conditions. So these observations lead to the conclusion that evaluation should always consider not only whether the evaluation has what we call internal validity, that it gives an accurate assessment of what happened, but also external validity and applies to the entire population of interest. Next slide, please. Statistical power and effect sizes. So this is a little bit wonky, I'm sorry to say. I just discussed broad issues related to evaluation designs and their ability to support causal claims and to be generalized. This part of the evaluation focuses on some narrower technical decisions about executing evaluations in practice. We'll talk first about statistical power analysis and then outcome measures and impact estimation issues. The first of these technical topics is an evaluation statistical power to detect impacts. Most of the evaluations indicated that they conducted a power analysis in designing the evaluation, but the details were not always provided in the reports. Having too small a sample means that the evaluation might not be able to detect effects of a policy relevant magnitude with a high enough level of statistical significance so that we can be confident of the findings. Some evaluations cited cost as the reason for having too small a sample, as the cost sometimes turned out to be much higher than was anticipated. Even with a sufficient overall sample size, we might be interested in the impacts on specific subgroups, and so evaluation should be planned to achieve sufficient sample sizes for priority subgroups. On the slide, I give an example of one that had that. So our conclusion here is that the power analysis is a very important thing to conduct in designing the evaluations so that the results are credible. Next slide, please. Outcome measures. The most common outcome measures that were used in just about all the studies were employment and earnings, usually whether or not people worked, sometimes hours of work, and earnings was generally measured annually. The studies mostly measured total earnings, but sometimes they measured whether earnings exceeded substantial gainful employment, which is used in determining continuing eligibility. Another outcome that was sometimes measured was benefit receipt and amounts. And some evaluations used time for processing applications. We thought a limitation of these evaluations is that they did not always include the accuracy of the determinations. Some evaluations used health outcome measures, including mortality. In doing so, they used self-assessment or quick measures such as the mini mental state evaluation and the mental health inventory. Some evaluations use surveys to capture other outcomes that aren't available in administrative data. That includes hours worked, other unearned income, hourly wage rates, motivation, quality of life, health insurance, receipt of specific services, and understanding the rules of the demonstration. So conclusions here, evaluations focused on the most important outcomes, and we thought it might be useful for SSA to standardize the measures of health, specifically where there are a lot of potential measures available. Next slide, please. So impact evaluation issues. The SSA studies almost all but relied on what's called an intent to treat impact measure. That simply means that they compared the outcomes for people who were assigned to receive the treatment to the outcomes for people in the control or comparison group. I'll get back to that in a minute with one of the alternatives. The methods used were typically ordinary least squares for continuous outcomes and logistic analysis, or LOGIC, for dichotomous outcomes. The studies used weights, sometimes without explanation or sensitivity analysis, in their evaluations, and they used data from both surveys and administrative sources. So some comments on these issues. We suggest that consideration be given to estimating the impact of the treatment on the treated, what's sometimes called TOT, which requires more assumptions than the intent to treat approach, but often answers important policy issues. With respect to weighting strategies, we think more work needs to be done on this topic, and it is somewhat controversial. We suggest that the evaluations conduct sensitivity analysis on their weighting strategies and explain what their preferred strategy is and why. There's substantial literature on how surveys and administrative data can lead to different findings. And given that these evaluations commonly use both, there's the potential for first understanding better the intervention's impact by seeing how the impacts differ across databases, but also for informing the literature about the conditions under which survey or administrative data provide better estimates. Next slide, please. Several additional data issues have implications for the findings. So, for example, the follow-up periods varied among the studies. Some of the studies looked at very short-term events, like, for example, improving the process for application, and there the follow-up was relatively brief, a year or less. But most of the evaluations looked at the issue of whether or not these particular demonstrations were able to increase employment and earnings over the long run. And in those cases, the follow-up periods lasted 5 years, 10 years, or often longer. That's not difficult to do because you can use the Social Security earnings data, which is automatically collected for all people in the country. There were two types of missing data that were accounted for in the studies. When an entire unit didn't respond if someone was missing, that was dealt with by weighting the observations to take account of the prevalence of different types of people. And if individual items were missing, that was usually dealt with by imputing the missing data. Two of the evaluations dealt explicitly with what is called the multiple hypothesis testing issue. The issue here is that if you conduct enough statistical hypothesis tests, as is often the case when the evaluations look at a lot of incomes across multiple sites and across multiple subgroups, we increase the chance of identifying one or more as statistically significant when the true impact is zero. In response to that problem, two of the studies used an approach to limit that issue. The Bond study and the YTD study both used an approach called developing confirmatory hypotheses, where only a few of the many hypothesis tests that were conducted were listed as confirmatory and were focused on for policy implications, and the others were considered exploratory. In addition, the Bond study used a statistical correction to adjust the significance levels to account for the fact that there were multiple hypotheses tested. And we thought that the approach used in Bond and in the YTD are worth replicating in future studies. A final point on the evaluations and data is that most of the studies took place in multiple sites, and most of the evaluations that had similar treatments across sites pooled the data to come up with an overall impact. But some of the evaluations had very diverse either treatments or groups of people across sites, and in those cases, the estimation was done separately for each site. Next slide, please. Beyond impact evaluation. Well, our focus in the chapter is on impact evaluations, but there are other types of evaluation. We just wanted to mention them here. In addition to implementation, you have impact evaluation, you have implementation or process studies, participation analysis, and cost-benefit analysis. Implementation studies are important to find out how the specific demonstration was implemented, what the comparison or control group got, and whether people understood the treatment and whether the demonstration was implemented with fidelity. These can be very important, and most of the studies did include that. Participation analysis looks at the relationship between the intervention and which people participate. Finally, cost-benefit analysis is very important for making a decision on whether a program is worth implementing overall. Cost-benefit analysis assigns monetary values to all the benefits and then compares them to the costs of the treatment. Last slide, please. In sum, Social Security Administration's decades of demonstrations provide quite rigorous evidence on the impacts of various interventions aimed to improve the labor market and well-being of individuals with disabilities and to improve the application process. These evaluations provide useful models and lessons for future evaluation research in terms of ensuring high-quality evidence to inform public policy. And we would like to encourage Social Security to continue this admirable record. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Now I will turn it over to Jesse Rothstein for some comments.
Thank you very much for having me. You can put up my next slide. So I really enjoyed reading this paper. It was a great overview of and kind of catalog of all of the different evaluations and demonstration studies that SSA has done. I copied a table out of the paper just to show people all the kind of comprehensive list here. And I found it really useful in kind of thinking through how they all related to each other. As a discussant, I have the luxury of not being comprehensive and of just picking on the pieces that I find interesting. So I'm going to do that. I'll divide it up to two parts. One, kind of talking about a couple of the aspects of the design that this paper talked about that I think deserve a little bit more attention in the design of future studies. And then second, talking about how there's some interplay between the design of the study and how the results will be used for policy purposes. Next slide. So I'll start with a couple of design aspects. One, the paper does a good job and the presentation does a good job of talking about how it's really important in each of these evaluations to include a power calculation and to make sure that before you start the study, you know exactly how much precision you're going to have. But it's also important to treat that not just as a technical part of the analysis report, but as a part of the design of the study in the first place. The useful thing about a power calculation is not that you do the calculation, but that you think beforehand about how big the effect needs to be in order to be what in medicine they call clinically significant, and then make sure that your study is powered to be able to identify that. So you need to, before you design the study, decide how big or small the effects need to be to matter. And then after the study, compare your results to that. Often in these evaluations, it ends up working in somewhat the reverse. We have a budget, we figure out how many observations we're going to be able to pay for, and then we do a power calculation and figure out how big of an effect we'll be able to detect, without ever really going back and saying, well, is that a big enough effect? Or is that a small enough effect that this will be a useful result? So I think it's important to build in the kind of policy part of that into what looks like a technical piece. A second issue is on the representativeness of the samples. The authors talk about population representativeness, and I think that's an important issue to think about. But in a lot of these studies, partly by nature of the way that the kind of legal authority under which they're conducted, you're really relying on people to volunteer for the program. And if they know what the program is going to be that they're volunteering to potentially be randomized into, you have to worry a lot that the people who volunteer are the ones who expect to gain from this new program. And that makes them pretty non-representative, even if they look demographically representative on traditional measures. But that really limits our ability to generalize the results of the studies to thinking about what would happen if we rolled out these new policies to the whole population, not just to volunteers. Suggestion for the future is to think more about building study of that question into the design of the studies. For example, you could randomly assign some people to be eligible for an extra incentive if they participate. The bigger the incentive to participate, the more people you expect to join, even if the specific treatment isn't all that useful for them, and the more representative you'd expect the participants to be. And if you can measure how the treatment effect varies with the incentive that people face to participate, you can then learn something about how important that self-selection problem is. A third issue, this is a really minor technical point on missing data, that the paper talked about how when there's item missingness, the studies have usually done mean imputation. I think it would be worth at least exploring multiple imputation strategies to try to understand how sensitive the results are to the imputation. but that's a fairly technical detail. A more substantive detail is about site effects. These demonstrations typically take place in a few sites, a few different locations. Usually a small number, so we don't have enough observations to really study the variation across the sites. But if you look at other kinds of evaluations that have been done by other agencies in other settings, we often find that the site effects are really large, that a given program has very different effects in some locations than in other locations, often in ways that weren't anticipated before we set up the evaluation. That's important to understand. And I think when we only have 3 or 4 sites, we really limit our ability to understand that. But I think it's really useful for thinking about what the results of the study will tell us for broader questions about how to implement policy. If a program works moderately well on average, that's one thing. But if it works extremely well in some places and not at all well in other places, that's going to have very different implications for what would happen if we roll it out more generally, especially if it ends up working especially well in places that are not random, but have particular characteristics that may not be all that common in the broader world. For example, if you have implementation partners, and some of them are really hotshot and some of them are only okay, and the program only works when you have a really hotshot in the sites that have really hotshot implementation partners, that tells you something about how well it's going to work when you roll it out more generally. And I think that's something we need to understand better. It's hard. There's a reason why we only use a few sites, but I think it's something that is worth at least thinking hard about. It gets at a distinction that was prominent in the paper about efficacy studies versus efficiency studies that I'll talk about more in the rest of my comments. But if we're interested in just understanding whether the program could work, then maybe understanding the side effects isn't so important. But if we're interested in whether it will work on a large scale, understanding the distribution of these side effects and how they relate in the sample of sites that are in this study to what they would look like in the broader population is really important. And with that, let me ask for the next slide. And I apologize, I forgot a slide for, but this is the slide. That's okay. And one more slide. I want to talk now about the interplay between the design of the evaluation and the usage of the results in policy. The paper talks a lot about the distinction I just mentioned between efficacy and effectiveness, where efficacy is about testing the optimum implementation of an intervention at a small scale, and effectiveness is about considering the program in a real-world setting, often at a large scale. I think it's useful to step back from the design of evaluations and think about what are the questions we would like to answer from a policy perspective. And I think of them as kind of 4 steps. One is we want to know whether a particular mechanism operates. If we have a theory about how to get more people to work, we want to understand whether that theory is right, that is a problem that is stopping people from working. Second, we want to know whether we can design a program to activate that mechanism. If the mechanism is real, is there any real world program we could implement that would get at it? Third, assuming we can design a program to activate that mechanism, there may be many possible programs. And what's the best, most effective program among those that do? And then fourth, once we've implemented a program, we want to know whether it's successful, where that could have to do with the theory of the program, but more often it has to do with whether it actually scales successfully, or whether it winds up being a different program when it's actually in operation than it was when it was on the planning stage. And those are related to this efficacy versus effectiveness, but the way that the studies end up translating into policy doesn't always line up with that perfectly well. So I thought I'd take an example of the Ticket to Work evaluation. This is a program that gave SSI and SSDI participants vouchers that they could use for training and employment services. And the real question in the evaluation was, did this get more people to work? The mechanism we're interested in here is, are there skills gaps that are stopping people from being employed? Are there things that employment services can help people match the jobs? Are those the barriers that are stopping people from getting jobs? And we'd really like to know whether that's true, independent of whether any particular program is successful at giving people those skills or providing people services. Then if we knew that mechanism is in operation, we then want to know whether we can design programs that overcome those barriers and what program features are successful at getting people to actually show up for the training and getting them over the hurdles they face. And then once we designed a program that can do that at a small scale, we want to know whether it can continue to work at scale. How does this actually work in practice? Well, we often, next slide, please. We often jump straight to testing effectiveness. We have a theory in mind about a barrier that might be there. We then design a program that we think gets at that theory. And we go straight to studying that very specific program as a program without ever really studying the question of, is this barrier a live barrier with the same tools? I'm borrowing an idea here from Jeff Kling and co-authors about what they call mechanism experiments, where you might design an experiment that's not really about testing a specific program that you would ever roll out on a larger scale. It's designed, the sole goal is testing whether a mechanism operates, and that you might use a program that you would never scale for what either because it's too expensive or because you couldn't implement it on a large scale. You might design that program to test the mechanism, even though you know that you're not going to use that program on a large scale. What we end up doing in practice is we test our program, our very specific program, on a fairly small scale. We never really test it at a large scale, but we act as if the results apply at the large scale. When we get our results back, we act as if that says the program works or it doesn't work, rather than that they're just a proof of concept that it can work or not. If the program fails, we often interpret that as saying that the mechanism doesn't operate. But in fact, the mechanism might well operate and we just have a bad program to get at it. And then if it succeeds, we rarely get around to testing it again at a large scale. Once the program works, we say, okay, we're done. We're going to just roll this program out or a program like it. And doing the large scale effectiveness studies is much rarer, partly because they're very expensive to do. But we just assume that works. And I will stop there. This is a great paper. It gave me a lot of useful thoughts, and I think it's a great way of teeing off this conference.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse, for those thoughtful comments. I'm now going to turn it over to Jack Small again, who'll take some time to share his thoughts.
Thank you. And for context, I'm currently at the Urban Institute, but my remarks reflect 27 years at the Office of Management and Budget. Much of the time I was in the office that was responsible for the Social Security Administration. I agree with Jesse that Bert and David did a very impressive paper and a very thorough discussion of SSA's past demonstrations, the evaluation methodologies they used, and the evaluation techniques that SSA should consider for future demos. And I sort of want to pick up on Jesse's last slide where he raised the question of what questions are we trying to answer, and really kind of focus on the agenda going forward for how we redesign kind of the demonstration authority, and also how we sort of think about this as a kind of a national demonstration authority, not purely focusing on the Social Security programs, but more generally how we can do demonstration projects to help people with disabilities. And so to do that, the focus for the demonstration authority should be redesigned to be much broader. And as Bert and David described, the current unit of analysis is individuals receiving or potentially receiving SSDI, SSI, or both benefits. And if we view this as more of a national demonstration authority, we'd recognize that there's many people who identify as having a disability who have no attachment to either SSDI or SSI. And that there are a lot of other programs that are serving that population, but have generally much less funds for demonstrations and much more limited legal authorities, perhaps with the exception of CMS. And consider, for instance, the Department of Education's vocational rehabilitation system. We see really very few rigorous evaluations, that is random assignment type of evaluations within the VR system, and yet we're spending billions of dollars there, and do not have kind of the evidence base to know what types of VR services are most effective. And consider the National Workers' Compensation Program. Here, the most interesting experiment was one Washington State did with the Centers for Occupational Health and Education, but the impetus for that was entirely at the state level and at the academic level. The impetus was not at the federal level, and yet we learned a great deal from that effort. And consider state and private sector short-term disability insurance benefits. We have a very limited U.S. evaluation research base, even though at an international level, there's a lot of experimentation that's going on around short-term disability benefits. SSA's current focus with many evaluations on returning to work for existing beneficiaries and with a priority on achieving budget savings for SSDI and SSI is missing an opportunity. And with a broader charter, we could better test and evaluation interventions where programs intervene far earlier with at-risk individuals who have really no connection to Social Security programs or even an awareness of the programs. And the Department of Labor's Office of Disability and Employment Policy and SSA have made a start on this with the retain demonstration, that is, retaining employment and talent after injury and illness. And then there's a lot of other proposals by people like Jennifer Christian, David Stapleton, David Mann, Yanni Ben Shalom, and many others. And looking ahead, there's a great deal of interest in government paid medical leave as part of comprehensive paid parental caregiving and own medical leave. We see strong support at both the state and the federal level for that kind of a program. When we have a medical leave benefit in a state program now, it's frequently for as much as 12 weeks of own medical leave. And how should we intervene when a worker exhausts that medical leave benefit and they're still not capable of returning to work? These programs have a readily identifiable target population that's at risk and should be the scope of more rigorous evaluations for finding ways to intervene and help them stay in the workforce. So my second recommendation is that in terms of specific SSA demonstrations, we need to examine SSA's own internal eligibility determination process. So how do we design process evaluations that are not evaluating a new intervention, but are evaluating SSA's own internal disability determination steps or processes? And as past research, as Bert and David have described, where there was a focus on the determination process were mainly proof of concept types of evaluations, and in some cases a narrow targeted intervention, such as for people who are homeless. All kind of useful efforts, but far too limited in terms of what SSA's needed, given that the serious problems we have with SSA's current process, particularly the years it can take someone to receive an ultimate disability determination. Consider, for example, for about 20 years, SSA didn't perform reconsideration reviews at the state level in about 20% of the country. Recently, SSA began to reinstate those reviews, even though the evidence base was limited and various experts disagreed on fundamental aspects of the value of that stage of the process. States perform these initial determination and they perform the reconsideration reviews. And in some other programs, we leverage state level variation in program delivery to learn more. But we don't do this in SSA, and it's a missed opportunity. We could test more and less intensive reconsideration reviews and compare their effectiveness. So we know a protracted process that takes years to have a person receive a disability determination has serious problems. From research by Mastis, Mullen, and Strand, we know that a very delayed decision leads to a decay in the applicant's work capacity. In other words, SSA's current process that causes some people to wait several years for a decision functions in effect as an intervention with adverse outcomes for those denied applicants. Those findings are primarily an indictment of the protracted hearings level stage of the review. Could we improve the earlier stages so fewer applicants need to go before an ALJ? Commissioner Barnhart tested an alternative, but the test was suspended under Commissioner Astrew before we had the full results. How do we redesign the process to function better? And how do we evaluate those efforts? If we invest more in making better decisions earlier, how do we evaluate what is a better decision? This is another area that requires Congress to reimagine the role of SSA's current demonstration authority and to redesign a broader mandate for both SSA and for other agencies. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack, for those comments. We are going to take about a 5-minute break and resume with the next session in this panel at 10 till the top of the hour. See you soon.
Hello, everyone. We're about to get started.
Panel of the State of the Science meeting on lessons learned from SSA demonstrations. This is the second presentation and will focus on the use of demonstrations. Robert Weathers and Austin Nichols have written a delightful paper on this topic, and Bob will share with you some insights from that paper over the course of about the next 15 minutes, after which we'll have two discussants, Jonah Gelbach and Elizabeth Kurta. They'll share their thoughts on this paper. Then, at what we're guessing will be about 11:25 Eastern, we'll see, we will have general discussion and Q&A. So on that point, you are free to place any questions that you have in the Q&A box on WebEx. And for now, I will turn it over to Bob Weathers on the use of demonstrations.
Thank you, Laura. It's been a pleasure to co-author this chapter with Austin Nichols. These are our views and not necessarily the views of the Social Security Administration or the federal government. Next slide. Our chapter covers 5 broad topics: when to use a demonstration, when to evaluate, improving demonstration and evaluation design, improving data use, both surveys and administrative data, maximizing the use of demonstration findings, and building a stronger evidence base. Next slide. A demonstration is a trial program or a policy change, and we refer to such changes as an intervention. Many of SSA's demonstrations are applied to a random subset of the population, referred to as a treatment group, and another randomly selected group that receives business as usual serves as the control group. This is referred to as a randomized controlled trial, and when they're practical and appropriate, they're a rigorous way of identifying causal impacts of an intervention. Depending on policy constraints, it's possible to assess a program or a policy in other ways. At one end of the spectrum, an initial pilot project might be used to work through implementation and operational issues with a new program and to assess its feasibility. At the other end of the spectrum, simply rolling out the intervention on a national scale using randomly staggered rollout might be appropriate and provide a basis for program evaluation. For a variety of reasons, some evaluations are more practical to do outside of a demonstration context. For example, the effects of interest might be too small to identify using a demonstration, or it might be difficult to approximate conditions of an ongoing national program. Program entry effects are an example of where these factors make it impractical to use a demonstration. SSA has done a tremendous job at implementing and evaluating programs through demonstrations, as well as using other methods, but there are opportunities to do more. Next slide. One opportunity is to design projects that inform a wider array of policy options. For example, one work disincentive within the disability program is a complete elimination of the monthly benefit check once a person earns an earnings amount above the substantial gainful activity level. This sudden loss of benefits is referred to as the cash cliff, and it's a substantial additional tax on earnings. Policies that gradually reduce benefits as earnings increase, referred to as benefit offsets, are aimed at reducing the work disincentive, but they maintain some additional tax on earnings. There are a variety of ways to gradually reduce benefits. Some may be more effective at encouraging work than others. The benefit offset demonstrations to date have focused on a $1 for $2 benefit offset, with some variation in the amount of earnings or the time period where the benefit offset would begin. We suggest expanding the range of potential benefit offsets. For example, a demonstration that completely eliminates the extra tax by allowing beneficiaries to work and maintain their entire benefit payment. This would test the extent to which the cash cliff is a work disincentive. However, exploring a range of benefit offset policies would be desirable in obtaining a more complete picture. Factorial designs, as described in Barno and Greenberg, are one option to do this. Another opportunity is to make greater use of theoretical models. We identify several advantages of using these models. First, they may identify counterintuitive outcomes. For example, a simple economic labor supply model describes unexpected effects from a benefit offset. The counterintuitive effect is due to those who have their benefits suspended due to work activity under existing rules. Under the benefit offset, the model illustrates that they will receive a partial benefit under the benefit offset, and some may even reduce their work activity because of the extra income they receive from the benefit offset. We found this to be the case in the benefit offset pilot demonstration. Second, a well-specified theoretical model may be estimated and validated using data from a demonstration project, and then used to simulate policy responses for other policy changes. This approach has been used by others. For example, Petra Todd and Ken Wolpen used results from the school subsidy program to estimate and validate a life cycle model of fertility decisions and the number of years of education. They then used the model to simulate the effects of alternative subsidies on fertility and education outcomes. A similar approach could be used in SSA demonstrations. The use of falsifiable logic models are another opportunity. SSA has done a commendable job of incorporating logic models in the demonstration projects. Almost all of the design reports identified expected inputs, outcomes, and impacts from an intervention, but do so qualitatively. Epstein and Clareman proposed the use of falsifiable logic models that involve specifying in greater detail the expected inputs and intermediate outcomes in a logic model that are expected to produce quantitative outcomes. If the inputs and outcomes are not achieved, then you would have less confidence that the impacts are theoretically achievable. They propose this as a means for identifying pilot projects that might be ready for a more rigorous evaluation and minimizing the costs of potentially expensive demonstrations that show small effects, as is the case in some of SSA's demonstrations. But they're also useful for providing quicker results on the potential effects of a rigorous demonstration. We see an opportunity for SSA to examine variation or heterogeneity in average treatment effects. Examining differences in average treatment effects can answer the questions about for whom the policy is effective. Differences in impacts by specific subgroups, for example, by age, impairment type, or other characteristics is one way to address the for whom question, and this will be covered later today by Telvon Watcher. Interventions might have different effects among those at different points in the distribution, such as an earnings or income distribution. Thus, the standard approach of measuring mean impacts can miss meaningful effects from an intervention. A good example is a paper by Bittler, Gelbeck, and Hoynes, who examined such effects in a welfare reform experiment called Jobs First. This approach would be useful for SSA demonstrations, where the effects may differ within the distribution, whether it's earnings, income, health, or other outcomes. Third, an intervention might not be used by all treatment group members, and some control group members might access the intervention. In these instances, we are interested in whether the intervention is effective for those who accessed it because they were assigned to the treatment group, or the effect of the treatment on the treated. The Oregon Health Insurance Experiment is a great example of estimating such effects. This experiment involved offering a randomly selected group the opportunity to enroll in Medicaid, and only 25% of the group took the offer. The experiment estimated the effectiveness of being offered Medicaid and the effectiveness of using it. A similar approach is potentially important for many of SSA demonstrations, including Project Network, promoting readiness of minors on SSI or PROMIS, and the accelerated benefits demonstration. And there are also opportunities to enhance cost-benefit analysis. Most of SSA's demonstration projects examine the effects of demonstration project from a Social Security trust fund's perspective. Bond is an exception, and it includes a cost-benefit analysis from society's perspective. This perspective is important. Many programs produce a net cost to the government, but produce significant value to society. The approach that APT used with Bond provides sufficient details on assumptions and methods and includes a sensitivity analysis. The estimates appear reasonable given the impact estimates and the assumptions, but the assumptions have led some to criticize the approach. Another approach that is promoted by Nathan Hendren and co-authors is also useful. At a high level, their approach uses information to identify society's willingness to pay for a policy or program. An advancement of their approach is that it provides a consistent method for assigning a net value to various public programs and therefore allowing one to make comparisons across programs and policies. Next slide. Evaluations of demonstration projects require good data. SSA demonstrations relied on the collection of survey data to obtain the specific data needed for an evaluation. Among the concerns with survey data, two stand out: low response rates and the quality of the responses. Importantly, low response rates are a growing concern. The most recent National Beneficiary Survey that SSA conducted had about a 65% response rate, well below the 80% standard identified by the Office of Management and Budget. SSA demonstrations have also relied on administrative data to obtain information. Administrative data is generally available for all demonstration project participants, and there are fewer concerns about the quality of the data compared to surveys. However, the data from other federal agencies would improve SSA demonstrations. Data from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on expenditures, data from Office of Child Support Enforcement on quarterly wages, and data from the IRS on income would significantly enhance information drawn from many of SSA's demonstrations. Combining survey data and administrative data will be important for SSA to do in the future. Combining the data can be useful for an assessment of low survey response rates or potential selection bias, and the assessment of reliability of survey responses. For example, employment and earnings could also be performed with administrative data. Dave Wittenberg, Jeff Hemmeter, and co-authors have a nice paper that shows how this may be done. Next slide. Communications are another potential area for improvement. Engaging stakeholders early and often is important. Stakeholders can be invaluable partners with the design and implementation of demonstration. SSA has begun to make greater use of technical evaluation panels, which is a step in the right direction, but engaging other stakeholders such as the Social Security Advisory Board and the disability community through SSA's National Disability Forums are two other ways that SSA can continue to improve demonstrations. Getting results out faster is another opportunity. SSA might explore the use of shorter findings briefs to highlight key results sooner. The GSA's Office of Evaluation Sciences provides a model of shorter findings briefs that can be provided relatively quickly and that are accessible to a wide audience. The Department of Labor has a model of communicating results using email, and there are opportunities to make greater use of social media to communicate findings quickly and efficient. Next slide. Building a stronger evidence base. First, the use of qualitative findings. SSA's final reports have relied heavily on quantitative findings on impacts, which are the bottom line for most readers. But there are opportunities to make greater use of qualitative findings on the experiences of demonstration project participants to provide a more complete picture of the demonstration. Individual experiences can provide a powerful way of explaining quantitative results. Making data available for reanalysis is also important. While the final reports produced by demonstrations have been very informative, there's plenty of room for reanalysis of the demonstration. Replication and reanalysis are useful in adding additional credibility to the results. In addition, extending the results through new analysis can provide policymakers with important information. Synthesizing the results across demonstration projects. SSA has assembled a large body of high-quality demonstrations. There are opportunities to synthesize results across all these projects. Today's conference is a great first step, but it took a long time to get here. Building on this effort in the future has the potential to improve the evidence policymakers may need and further improve SSA's approach to conducting demonstrations. And next slide. So the key takeaways: SSA is operating state-of-the-art demonstrations at scale, and this is an enormous accomplishment. We identify opportunities to build on SSA's strong foundation and leverage current opportunities. For example, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018 emphasizes the role that demonstration projects and evaluations should play in forming program policies. Our chapters focused on 3 questions. What research questions need to be answered? How should the questions be addressed? And how can we maximize the use of answers? That concludes our presentation. I'll pass it over to Laura and the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So now our first discussant is Jonah Gelbach. I'll turn it over to him to reflect on this paper.
Thanks very much. I'm Jonah Gelbach, and I'm an economist and professor of law at Berkeley Law. I'm delighted to comment today on Chapter 3 by Robert Weathers and Austin Nichols. This chapter provides a wide-ranging assessment of how to make the most out of the Social Security Administration's demonstrations. I found the chapter both comprehensive and insightful. I'll focus my comments on one observation Weathers and Nichols make. Quote, that past relevant demonstrations themselves might be subjected to a cost-benefit analysis before launching a new demonstration. They suggest such an analysis requires thinking broadly about the general goals of demonstrations ex ante, their added value, and how we might judge them ex post. That's also a quote. These are excellent suggestions because, as Weathers and Nichols emphasize, undertaking a new demonstration incurs substantial opportunity costs, and not just those related to government funds. We'd like to know that the benefits justify the total cost. So we can go to the first slide, please. A good example is the chapter's discussion of the impact of program parameters on the composition of program participants and applicants, that is, entry effects. Weathers and Nichols discuss SSA's consideration of whether such effects could be productively studied for SSDI using a traditional randomized controlled trial, or an RCT. Because such a demonstration would need to target initial non-participants, SSA would need to target a sample from the US population as a whole. Reaching such a sample via a traditional demonstration would be expensive, given that the population level SSDI participation rate is quite low. An expert review suggested that to have a reasonable shot at detecting effects of interesting magnitudes, a demonstration would have to have something like 9 million participants. Weathers and Nichols describe additional challenges raised by the expert review, and they note that in the bond demonstration, SSA chose to focus on questions related to reform's effects on current participants, that is, only current participants. This discussion connects to a long-standing area of controversy among scholars studying causal effects of social programs. How much can we learn from RCTs, and should we concentrate our evaluation resources in that domain? Larger scale RCT social demonstrations have a long history, including the negative income tax experiments of the 1970s and the health insurance experiment of the 1970s and 1980s. When state-level welfare reforms were all the rage of the 1990s, numerous RCT demonstrations occurred. Now, the general argument for RCTs is familiar. They're supposed to balance differences in treated and control units so that researchers and policymakers may be confident observed outcome differences are due to an intervention's causal effects rather than differences in confounders. For this reason, smaller scale field RCTs have become more popular in recent years, especially in the area of development economics, for which economists Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer won the 2019 prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. Explaining its choice of topic area, the prize committee wrote in its scientific background document that, quote, the best way to draw precise conclusions about the true path from causes to effects is often to conduct a randomized controlled field trial. Note the word best in that sentence. One frequently hears the term gold standard applied to RCTs, and what could be better than gold? Actually, there's a serious case that the gold standard contributed importantly to the scope of the Great Depression. Now, this is a rhetorical point to be sure, but it's a good reminder that apparently unassailable things can have their flaws. And the case against RCTs isn't just rhetorical. Nobel laureate in economics Angus Deaton and philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright wrote in a 2018 paper that, quote, any special status for RCTs is unwarranted. The good statistical properties of RCTs hold only on average, they point out, rather than in any particular RCT. And RCTs suffer precision-related issues, which help explain why estimating SSDI entry effects would have required so many participants. Another issue is treatment effect heterogeneity, the idea that some people will respond more than others, or even in the opposite direction, when facing changed policy parameters. The limits of RCTs related to treatment effect heterogeneity is a subject that has long been discussed in economics. Another Nobel laureate, James Heckman, pointed out in a 1995 paper co-authored with Jeffrey Smith that RCTs, quote, do not identify the distribution of program gains unless additional assumptions are maintained. Now that's important because distributional considerations often are quite important to policymakers. To be sure, the fact that RCTs have their limits in the presence of heterogeneous effects doesn't mean distributional knowledge is out of reach, but it does mean some circumspection and careful attention to underlying theoretical considerations are warranted when considering RCT use. The 2019 Nobel Prize Committee itself embraced the role of economic theory in policy design. At the risk of immodesty, I'll point to my own work, which Robert Weathers mentioned in his presentation, co-authored with economists Marion Bittler and Hilary Hoynes, using data from Connecticut's Jobs First Welfare Reform RCT demonstration project. In studying Jobs First, we were able to connect predictions from basic labor supply theory to the ways in which a change in program parameters could be expected to operate across the earnings distribution of demonstration subjects. Our research was conducted entirely after the demonstration had finished, and it was possible only because MDRC's data from the demonstration were available for use by researchers via a not too onerous process. This raises an additional point, the value of making demonstration data publicly available for further study. There are other criticisms of RCT demonstrations. For example, as Heckman and Smith pointed out in their 1995 paper, typical RCTs reveal only short-run policy reform effects. Of course, the same is true about many non-experimental evaluations. More generally, as Banerjee and Duflo note, the fact that RCTs have their problems doesn't mean that non-experimental approaches are immune to those same problems. So what lessons can we draw from this discussion? First, well-designed, well-executed RCTs solve a particular class of statistical problem. They balance treated and control units on the distribution of confounding effects, on average within experiments. That allows someone with the data in hand to estimate some kinds of parameters that may be of policy interest. But second, even perfectly implemented RCTs don't allow us to answer every question of interest, either because some questions, such as entry effects, are by their very nature difficult or expensive to study at all with RCTs, or because of the extent and nature of treatment effect heterogeneity. So whether RCTs are better than alternatives in any given context depends. It depends on the questions that are of interest, on the policy reform options, on the initially unknown distribution of people's responses to policy reforms under consideration, and on what will be done with the information obtained from the demonstration. Of course, whether RCTs are worth doing also depends on the alternative. We should always ask, compared to what? Next slide, please. There is a long history of non-experimental estimation in the social sciences. Both structural and reduced form econometric methods have developed in important part for the purpose of answering the kinds of questions that RCTs would answer if they existed. These points are not unknown to the discussion of SSA demonstrations, as the discussion of entry effects that Weathers and Nichols offer at pages 12 through 14 of their chapter illustrates. They cite an SSA-funded RAND paper by Nicole Mastis and co-authors Mullen and Zamaro, titled Research Designs for Estimating Induced Entry into the SSDI Program Resulting from a Benefit Offset, which describes two RCT alternatives, stated preferences and structural estimation using variation from policy changes. These authors considered but rejected alternative approaches, including more complex structural models. I suggest here that even where RCTs are feasible to design and administer at manageable cost, it is not obvious that they are always the best choice. One way to look at this issue is to recognize that the choice to use an RCT to study a question is itself a policy choice. The internal logic of the contention that RCTs are necessary for better policy study thus requires randomizing whether RCTs are used to study questions. That seems unlikely. What we have available is the considered ex-ante judgment of experts. SSA ought to use that resource liberally. I have one final suggestion. Next slide, please. SSA ought to invest in making its data more available to researchers operating outside either the agency itself or its contracted parties. There are lots of highly skilled researchers who want to study questions that are or would be of interest to policymakers, but who aren't able to do so because they can't get data. SSA could radically increase the amount of available research knowledge if it found ways to make existing administrative data more publicly accessible. Of course, there are privacy considerations and program operations must continue without interruption. But perhaps SSA should consider whether the next demonstration is likely to lead to information as valuable as we might gain were it to spend some of its resources figuring out how to productively share data for wider study. In sum, I applaud Weathers and Nichols' general suggestion that more thought should be given to whether particular demonstrations are worth the expense and time it will take to conduct them. There are alternatives, including non-experimental study in particular settings and wider data access in general. It's to SSA's credit that the agency has commissioned this volume, and it will be to all of our benefit if the agency follows these authors' suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. I appreciate you taking the time to read and consider the paper and share your thoughts. And now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Kurta for her thoughts on this.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to discuss Robert Weathers and Austin Nichols' paper on a very important topic, improving the use of demonstration projects. I'm Elizabeth Kurta, a director at the Government Accountability Office, and I typically oversee our reports on disability programs and issues. GAO provides audit and evaluation services to Congress regarding federal agencies and programs. Because of this, GAO has a body of work that speaks to many of the issues the authors raise. Our work covers a wide array of activities conducted by the federal government, such as demonstration projects, impact evaluations, and program magic. Next slide. Over the last 20 years, SSA has carried out many demonstration programs and spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. I really appreciate the author's focus on improving the use of demonstrations because the costs and consequences of a demonstration not being useful. A well-designed demonstration project that produces useful results can influence policy and potentially affect the lives of millions of disability beneficiaries. Chapter 3 suggests an array of possible improvements to enhance the effectiveness of SSA demonstration projects. These suggestions seem to fall into three main buckets: methodological, process, and communication improvements. I'm going to focus my remarks today on areas where the author's suggestions for improvement dovetail with prior GAO work. Many of these suggestions overlap with recommendations GAO has made in the past, as well as best practices we have identified both for demonstration projects specifically, as well as for project management and federal internal control standards that federal agencies should be using to manage programs more broadly. Next slide. The authors make a number of important points with respect to how demonstration projects can be most effectively designed. The one that stands out as a key design element is the suggestion to employ logic models in order to summarize assumptions, outcome pathways, and causal mechanisms. In the past, GAO has discussed in several reports that logic models can provide a framework that links the intervention to the goals and outcomes desired and has recommended their use in developing new programs as well as evaluations of programs. The authors also suggest demonstrations can and should test multiple intervention options and causal channels through multi-stage, multi-arm, or factorial design of interventions and experimental evaluations. Leveraging a large and costly demonstration project to test several policy options and explore multiple causal methods could be a good way to increase the bang for the buck of a given demonstration. However, doing so increases the complexity of a demonstration and requires careful design to be effective. GAO's work on designing evaluation stresses the need to be extremely clear about the evaluation questions at each phase of a project and what is being assessed. Processes versus outcomes versus impacts of alternative interventions, for example, and to select appropriate measures and criteria for success at each stage of a program's implementation. GAO has also stressed the need to assess an intervention's effects compared to a counterfactual of what would have occurred without the intervention. For instance, in our 2008 report on demonstration projects, we found that some demonstrations did not assess the project's effects compared to what would have happened in its absence. Further, we noted that planning for the evaluation has to be part of the demonstration project design. As part of that report, we recommended that SSA implement clear written policies and procedures that are consistent with standard research processes and federal internal control standards. As a result, SSA developed a demonstration project guidebook, which outlined the agency's policies, procedures, and mechanisms for managing and operating its demonstration projects. To the extent SSA adopts any of the recommendations from this panel, incorporating them into the guidebook would better ensure future evaluators consider their use. A key aspect of federal internal control standards that apply to demonstration projects is ensuring that high-quality data are used and data needs are clearly identified at the beginning of a project. In a recent report on HHS demonstration projects, we also pointed out that it is critical that baseline data are collected and comparison groups are established prior to the intervention. Another key principle that I think should be highlighted is the need to identify potential risks to the success of a demonstration project in advance. Identifying risks, as well as being prepared to analyze and respond to the risks, is another principle for internal control and encompasses at a high level some of the methodological considerations the authors highlight. This includes identifying and documenting trade-offs in scoping the demonstration project, identifying ways that the proposed methods or timeframes may fail to meet the needs of policymakers, and clearly understanding potential sources of bias in the analysis. Next slide. In the chapter, the authors stress the need to build a better evidence base by among other things, using qualitative information to provide context and explore causal mechanisms when reporting results. Taking that a step further, considering participant voices in the planning and design of an intervention could yield new insights and identify potential risks to the success of a demonstration. For example, in a 2010 forum on disability reform held by GAO, stakeholders, including those with a participant perspective, noted that new benefits, services, and programs need to be carefully structured to avoid unintended consequences, and that the costs and benefits to stakeholders, including participants, must be considered in the program design. Another process improvement I would add is to take steps to ensure transparency about changes to the demonstration along the way. GAO has found that changes during a demonstration can cause problems and affect the quality of the evaluation. Changes to the design of the demonstration, the sample, or related policies that may affect participants, etc., should be documented along the way, along with plans for how those changes will be handled in the evaluation. Next slide. The authors stress the need to involve stakeholders early and often, as well as to disseminate interim results to key stakeholders. This is standard operating procedure at GAO, as our internal control standards require appropriate internal and external communication. For example, at a bare minimum, we typically gather stakeholders at project initiation, then to review and comment on the proposed project design, then to approve the final project design, to discuss preliminary results and assess the evidence, to develop consensus around the meaning of findings, and to review and approve the key messages that the evidence supports. And after all of that, we include project stakeholders in reviewing report drafts. While this type of collaborative process takes time, we find it typically leads to more robust results, greater acceptance of our findings, and fewer surprises and rework at the end of the day. The authors also state that demonstration findings should be leveraged to affect policy through good communication. This is critical, and it's not a universal practice. GAO has recommended as recently as 2018 that agencies provide rigorous final evaluation reports and publicly released findings of demonstration projects. In addition, in our 2000 report on SSA demonstrations, we recommended that SSA established a formal final report process that includes a complete postmortem on the project and identifies outcomes, limitations, and policy options for Congress. SSA implemented this recommendation through its annual reports to Congress on its demonstrations and papers published in academic journals and online. However, I would point out that communication can be continuously improved. In our experience at GAO, it's necessary to communicate policy results to Congress in a manner far different than one would communicate in academic journals. A key aspect of this is developing high-quality communications that is geared toward the intended audience, which includes government agencies, Congress, as well as the general public. This is challenging, as we know at GAO. However, working to make the findings of demonstrations more reader-friendly and accessible to key audiences would go a long way to improving policymakers' ability to leverage demonstration results into action. And finally, going beyond the focus on individual demonstration projects, GAO has previously identified more than 40 programs managed by 5 different federal agencies that provide a patchwork of employment support for people with disabilities. We reported in 2012 that these programs lacked a unified vision, strategy, or set of goals to guide their outcomes. GAO has been recommending since 2012 that OMB work with federal agencies to coordinate the development of a set of unifying government-wide goals for employment of people with disabilities. Such an effort could provide much-needed focus and impetus for designing demonstration projects that align with federal employment goals. It could also help pave the way toward taking greater advantage of the wealth of federal data that is collected by different federal agencies, but requires Herculean efforts by agencies and researchers to share and use in these important evaluation efforts. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Liz. That was so interesting to me, and I think that your penultimate point in particular is a great transition to this discussion. Right, you were pointing out how dissemination efforts are really essential to ensuring that the findings from demonstrations reach various target audiences, and that's what this whole meeting is about. So thank you for that. I'd like to start with the Q&A by asking any of the presenters or authors if they would like to share comments in response to the discussant remarks. So that would be from the first paper, Bert and Dave, whether either of you want to say anything in response to the discussants, or likewise from this most recent panel, Austin or Bob, are you, do you have a response?
Well, this is Bert. I just want to say I appreciated the comments from both discussants. I think they were very helpful, and I would have liked to have had more time to talk about equity and efficiency trials as Jesse did. That was really good. But I agreed with all the comments, and I think they would be very helpful to implement.
Bob or Austin, do you have any observations in response to the comments?
I would just say that there are lots of interesting ideas being discussed here. Some of these, the past demonstrations that are discussed in the volume and that were in the presentation as well, are mandated by Congress. So, they're design features that are not easily accessible to SSA in some cases. But obviously, we would like to put those ideas out there anyway, and to sort of map out the space of demonstrations that could be conducted in the future, or non-demonstration evaluations.
So, Austin, that's an interesting point, and it's one that actually came in, relates to a question that came in from the audience about the linking of Medicaid and SSI or SSDI. And so you're making the observation that Congress has a strong hold on permission to a certain extent. Can you or someone talk about how one might go about changing the law needed not only for kind of mandatory participation of claimants or beneficiaries in demonstrations, but then also that observation about the linking of multiple programs and how you might understand the kind of the independent and collective effects of multiple social programs operating. And maybe, Bob, since you're an insider in the agency, that is a question for you.
Sure, I'll take a shot at that. I think one opportunity is through the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. There's an effort to really have federal agencies work more collaboratively together, not just in terms of data sharing, but in terms of service delivery. And I think that that's also a priority of the administration. So I think that in the coming years, we're going to see more collaborative efforts across federal agencies. And I will point out that SSA has worked with DOL and has worked with Department of Education on some recent efforts that I think are a step in that direction.
Great. So mentioning the administration's priorities, we also know that the president recently issued an executive order on equity, and I would like to hear from any and all of you how you think demonstrations in the future can ensure an attention to equity, I guess both with respect to the interventions as designed and tested, and also with respect to the approach to evaluating them.
Laura, I have some comments on that. I've given it a lot of thought because our program at George Washington University is emphasizing equity as well. Equity is not a simple topic, but a lot of the different aspects can and have been addressed in the Social Security demonstrations and others. So let me just talk about some of the aspects of equity. One has to do with access. And the question is, are people in different groups receiving equitable access? Maybe it's equal, or maybe it's based on priority. And that can be accomplished in several ways. One, to do it quantitatively, is the participation analysis that we mentioned, where you can actually try and assess quantitatively how do different groups who are offered the opportunity, how do they participate? And that can suggest different ways you can improve access to the programs. Secondly, impact evaluations are really amenable to looking at equity. And there's a couple tricky aspects there. One is that the subgroup analysis that we discussed can easily look specifically at equity of impact if you have a sufficiently large sample size to look at how does the program affect different people, and are the impacts similar or different across groups. But equal impacts isn't necessarily the only thing. This is one area where it does get somewhat tricky because some groups may start out more disadvantaged than others, and part of the equity concern may be closing the gap. So you'd want to look at more than just the magnitude of the impact, possibly. And then finally, the process studies can be very important for trying to understand how programs are implemented and whether groups are affected differently. I think this has come to light during the pandemic, especially, where we know that some groups, especially African Americans, have been more reluctant than others to participate in the vaccine because of past history. So the process analysis can help get at that. So those are some of the ways that you can address equity.
I appreciate that. What thoughts do others have on that topic?
I think I would just add that we need better kind of baseline information about the applicants for benefits to understand the characteristics in terms of kind of ratio and diversity and income, and because we don't know some fundamental things in terms of the rate at which people are being denied benefits, and whether that varies across states, and what kind of characteristics would explain those different allowance and denial rates. So before we actually do experiments, I think we need a better baseline for how equitable the program is as it's functioning today.
One just kind of statistical thought on top of the kind of very good points that other people have made. A lot depends on how exactly we frame the question. If we frame the question as, if there are, say, two subgroups, as is the effect of the program equally good for the two groups, that creates a situation where you need quadruple the sample size of what you would need to do to get the average effect. And that's often prohibitive, and so we end up not really being able to study that very well. But if you frame the question as, does this program benefit both groups, without really needing to be able to tell whether it's the same benefit, just making sure that it is beneficial, that only requires double the sample size, and it's a little more feasible. And so I think for the equity purposes, ideally we'd like to know if it's equal, but I think it's enough to know that the program is beneficial to both groups for many purposes.
Yeah, that's a really helpful observation, and I think too what the notion of closing gaps, right? So if people don't start on equal footing, but they end on closer to equal footing, that could be a move forward as well.
I just wanted to say, related to that.
Before I dip into another question, other thoughts on this? Yeah, Austin, please.
Sorry, related to Jesse's point about framing the question, I think another thing that should happen in future evaluations and demonstrations is a more diverse group of researchers should be involved in those projects from the very earliest stages. So a lot of the, when we talk about a falsifiable logic model or using a logic model, that's embedding a lot of the design into a set of causal relationships that sort of pin down where the evaluation goes from there. And having folks from different walks of life and researchers of color involved at those early stages could change the nature of the questions that are being asked.
I just wanted to echo that point. I have never designed or conducted an evaluation myself, although I've worked with data ex post. I can't imagine all of the many different issues that arise in thinking about how how a Social Security demonstration, particularly one related to DI, would affect different people. And I just think that without meaning in any way to besmirch anybody's choices here, I'm looking at a screen full of white people right now, and we're talking after the fact and so on. But I do think that, to echo Austin's point, I don't know anything at all about who is designing and conducting demonstrations already, but I do think that ensuring that there's a broad cross section, particularly along racial and ethnicity grounds, seems to me a very important one to take seriously.
And I just wanted to add that GAO is increasingly being asked to look at equity considerations and the programs that we evaluate. I can't speak to necessarily other agencies, but I know one challenge in examining racial equity issues at SSA is some limitations in the data that exists to be able to do that sort of easily. There are some sort of complicated data matching things that you can do, but they are less precise. And it has to do with just a change in the way SSA started collecting this or stopped collecting this data at some point. So there are some limitations there as to what SSA can do.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm going to move to another question, which is to, for your papers, you focused and delved very deeply into the rich history of SSA demonstrations. I'm going to ask you to step out of that for a second and think about what non-SSA experiment offers a model for SSA. Is there something that we should be learning from elsewhere in social policy evaluation that allows us to translate some useful advice for SSA in the future? So let's start maybe with the authors from Chapter 2, Bert and Dave. Do either of you have a top pick for your favorite non-SSA experiment that has insights for SSA?
Oh, I'm not sure the specific experiment, but there's been a lot of work on what the effects are on other family members in various experiments. Most SSA experiments, as best I can tell, focus almost entirely on the people receiving DI or SSI, but say very little about whether a particular treatment causes, say, a spouse to go to work or stop working, what the effects are on children, that sort of thing. I think other demonstrations provide good models for doing that.
Thank you. What about Austin or Bob from your? Oh, please go ahead.
This is Bert. I just wanted to add that I found some of the work that the Administration for Children and Families has done to be kind of interesting. They sometimes start with very big but difficult questions like how can we improve self-sufficiency, and then they make an award, and actually APT has done some of these as well as other large for-profit, nonprofit firms. Currently, there's the PACE study, which the first 3 years or so were devoted to coming up with what would the design be, what's the right way to attack the problem. And I don't know that Social Security hasn't done that, and it's a luxury sometimes you don't have, especially if Congress is telling you to give you answers in 3 years. But I did think there is something to that, where the contractor had 3 years to come up with, okay, what's the best way to address this? What do we already know? What should we be testing? So I'd like to see more of that done in not just SSA, but other agencies.
So I will say that the benefit offset demonstrations, I should say, had at least a 7-year run-up in terms of design. So there was a long period of time where various designs were mooted during that period. And also the Promise projects, in addition to others, had sort of family effects measured and family-based interventions as well. So there are different demonstrations in this long list that have done various things there. I would also, I like the idea of learning from PACE. I would also just mention the Health Professions Opportunity Grant, which Laura could say something about if she wanted. But that HPOG project, it's many sites across the country. There are effectively little mini experiments, little mini demonstrations happening at each of those sites, and there are different ways you can learn from that, from the way in which that was done, which could be a model for a future SSA demonstration potentially. Not to mention that the population of participants there is, hypothetically potential future entrants or applicants for SSA programs as well.
This is Bob. I'll mention.
Bob, did you want to weigh in on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll mention just two that come to mind. One is the Oregon Health Insurance Experiment and the other is the Moving to Opportunity. And I think the reason I point to those two is that those are two efforts where there is a real emphasis on maximizing the use of the demonstration project, getting the data out to researchers and doing subsequent analysis to maximize the use of the data drawn for those two experiments. So those are two that, in my mind, I'd like to use as kind of models in terms of maximizing the use of the data.
I'll just say I'm surprised.
Yes, so I think it's interesting that the.
Go
ahead, Austin.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to make the observation that the kind of recommendations that came in response to that question cross all phases of research, right? From the planning, right? And how to be sure that the intervention that you're evaluating is well-grounded to begin with. But then to your point, Bob, that at the tail end, ensuring that the data ultimately are available to researchers for kind of maxing out on what you can learn after the fact. So I think that there are definitely opportunities across the potential life cycle from soup to nuts, if you will, to learn from other evaluations and bring those in. Though, Austin, as you pointed out as well, I think that there are inklings of these insights already in existing SSA demonstrations. But what else did you want to share here?
I was just going to say I'm surprised that Bert didn't have anything about the unemployment insurance experiments to draw on, but I think there are lessons about intervention design there, probably.
Yes, I think some of the UI experiments have been really interesting. And they relate to SSA in some sense. They had to deal with different services and benefits and then restrictions. Sometimes we've been surprised by some of the findings. I worked with people from APT actually on the evaluation of the reemployment and eligibility assessment experiment. And there, I think the biggest problem was that the design as implemented in the 4 states we went to was so different that it was really hard to come up with overall conclusions across the programs. And it would have been nice to have more systematic designs and more states involved. Of course, that would have cost more, but that way we could have learned a lot more than what we did learn, which was a lot, which is that both the penalties and the services both help both help society and the claimants get back to work.
So this highlights some interesting dimensions of testing and intervention and evaluating it, where we have various populations, subpopulations that we're interested in looking at. The intervention takes place in multiple places. Sometimes it's justified in pooling and looking at as a single question. In other cases, as you highlighted to Austin with the HPOG example, that there's so much variation in what the intervention actually is across site that that provides an opportunity to leverage that variation to learn whether there are some particular flavors of the intervention that seem to be more effective than others. And I think we are trying to advance methods to do that. I think that we are at the point where we have no more time left for Q&A, but I want to thank all of the presenters and discussants. And let you know that we are taking a 15-minute break.